There is a kind of silence that comes over your life when you know something should have reached you by now, when the door should have opened, when the answer should have come through, when the support should have arrived, when the breakthrough should have landed in your hands, and yet somehow everything feels delayed, rerouted, withheld or lost in transit. Chosen one. This is the season many people misread because on the surface it looks like ordinary struggle, ordinary waiting, ordinary scarcity. But in the spirit, this is something more precise. This is a supply chain battle. What belongs to you has been facing resistance on its way to you. What should have flowed naturally has been interrupted. What should have been released easily has been held back by strange resistance, strange timing, strange blockages that do not fully make sense in the natural. But hear this with the deepest part of your spirit. God is not dependent on human systems. He is not nervous because a person delayed your opportunity. He is not confused because a door was shut in your face. He is not limited because the usual channel failed, the familiar support disappeared, or the expected provision dried up. The God who called you knows how to feed you anyway, sustain you anyway, and provide for you anyway. He knows your address even when systems lose the package. He knows how to make a table appear in a wilderness where nobody expected a meal. So before we go deeper, if this message is already speaking to your situation, subscribe, like this video, and comment, "God will feed me anyway" below. Let that be your declaration in this season, because this message is not here to entertain your fear. It is here to break it. And once you begin to understand why provision keeps getting delayed, you will stop calling yourself forgotten and start recognizing that resistance often appears around the lives of those who are closer to divine movement than they realize. There are seasons in your life when you can feel the strange friction everywhere. It is not just one delayed payment or one missed opportunity or one unanswered message. It is the repeated pattern of almost the repeated sensation of things getting close and then stalling, the repeated frustration of sensing that what you need exists but does not seem to arrive on time. Money gets delayed, help gets delayed, favor gets delayed. People promise support and then disappear. Applications linger, openings seem near and then go silent. Answers you prayed for feel suspended somewhere between heaven and earth. And this is where the chosen one can become deeply discouraged, because it is one thing to suffer because of your own mistakes. It is another thing to keep doing the right things and still experience repeated interruption. You begin to ask yourself difficult questions. Did I miss God? Did I do something wrong? Am I being ignored? Why does it feel like what other people receive naturally becomes a battle when it comes to me? But not every delay is random, and not every blockage is proof of failure. Sometimes repeated delay is the signature of resistance. Sometimes what you are encountering is not a verdict against your life, but evidence that your next level is being contested. Because the closer a chosen one gets to something significant, the more strange interference can begin to surround ordinary things. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks practical, bureaucratic, even explainable. But beneath the natural explanation, there can still be spiritual resistance pressing against the flow. The reason this becomes so painful is because delay does not merely affect your schedule. It touches your emotions, your confidence, your sense of stability, and sometimes even your faith. Delay can make you feel exposed. Delay can make you feel embarrassed. Delay can make you question your own value when you watch other people moving ahead while you remain in a kind of suspended terrain. Yet one of the hardest lessons in a chosen one's life is that delay is not always denial, and blockage is not always absence. Sometimes what is being delayed is being protected. Sometimes what is being interrupted is being redirected, and sometimes what is being resisted is being marked as important. Think about how often valuable things face opposition. It is rarely the empty vessel that draws attack. It is the vessel carrying oil. It is rarely the meaningless assignment that encounters strange pressure. It is the assignment carrying consequence. Your frustration is real and it should not be minimized. It's painful to live in a season where provision feels jammed, where momentum feels arrested, where your heart keeps reaching for a sign that something is moving. But that pain must be interpreted correctly. You're not automatically forgotten because something is late. You're not automatically abandoned because the answer has not landed. In many cases, the very repetition of the delay is showing you that this season is not casual. Something about your life, your calling, your next step, or your assignment carries enough significance that the flow itself is being challenged. And once you begin to understand that, you stop reading every delay as personal failure and start asking a more discerning question: what exactly is trying to interfere with the movement of provision in my life? That question matters because the real attack is often more sophisticated than people realize. The enemy does not always attack you head on. Sometimes the enemy attacks the flow around you. Sometimes the strategy is not to destroy your body, your mind, or your visible circumstances in an obvious way. Sometimes the strategy is to target the movement of things, to slow access, to distort timing, to complicate relationships, to exhaust channels, to create confusion in communication, to make the road between you and what has been assigned to you feel crowded with invisible detours. This is why some seasons feel less like direct pain and more like continuous interruption. You do not always feel broken, but you feel blocked. You do not always feel attacked in your health or emotions first, but you feel like nothing moves cleanly. One conversation should have solved the issue, but it did not. One connection should have opened the door, but it stalled. One opportunity should have shifted your season, but it evaporated. This is the enemy attacking flow. Because if the enemy cannot destroy the chosen one completely, he often tries to convince the chosen one that support has disappeared, that provision has dried up, that help is too far away, that no one is coming, that God has somehow withdrawn. This is not only an external strategy, it is psychological and spiritual. The goal is to produce a feeling of abandonment. The goal is to make you think the silence means neglect. The goal is to make you interpret interruption as rejection. The goal is to make you weary enough to give up before the rerouting is complete. And this is where many chosen ones suffer more than necessary, because they spend the season misnaming the battle. They think they are under a curse of unworthiness when the real issue is contested flow. They think they have been singled out for punishment when the real issue is access being attacked. They think God has gone quiet when in fact the enemy is making noise in the channels. Look carefully at what often gets hit in these seasons. Timing becomes unstable. Relationships that should have functioned smoothly become strained. Resources that once seemed steady become unpredictable. Communication becomes delayed or misunderstood. Open doors become confusing. Plans get tangled. You may even notice that people who genuinely wanted to help you become inconsistent for reasons they cannot fully explain. This is because the attack is not always against intention, it is against transmission. It is against delivery. It is against the smooth arrival of what was meant to nourish, stabilize, and advance you. But even here, there is a deeper mercy working beneath the surface. Because once you realize the flow is under attack, you stop making an idol out of channels. You stop believing that one job, one person, one system, one institution, or one source is the final gatekeeper of your survival. You begin to see more clearly that the enemy has been trying to use channel disruption to distort your image of the source. If he can make you think the channel is everything, then when the channel fails, you panic as though God has failed. But the chosen one must learn a higher truth. Channels are temporary, source is eternal, systems are limited, God is not. Human delivery methods can be delayed, divine intent cannot be cancelled, and that is why this battle, painful as it is, becomes a revelation. It shows you that provision is bigger than the visible road it usually travels on. It shows you that what is assigned to your life may have to take an unexpected path, but that does not mean it will not arrive. Once that understanding enters your spirit, something changes in the way you wait. You no longer wait like someone abandoned. You wait like someone discerning. You wait like someone watching for rerouting. You wait like someone who knows that blocked flow is not the same as absent supply. And that is where faith begins to breathe again, because God has never been limited by the systems people trust too much. Human systems are useful, but they are not sovereign. People can delay what they were meant to release. Institutions can malfunction. Markets can shift. Doors can close. Support can disappear. Familiar paths can collapse beneath your feet. Yet none of that puts God into a crisis. He has never needed the usual channel to fulfill an unusual calling. This is one of the deepest comforts available to the chosen one in a supply chain battle. God does not need the route you expected. He can bless through another road. He can provide through a person you never noticed. He can open an opportunity in a place you did not search. He can create movement in the very area where everything looked stuck. If one brook dries up, he can command ravens. If one nation becomes barren, he can send you to a widow. If one employer shuts the door, he can create favor from another field entirely. If people decide to withhold what should have been released, heaven does not wring its hands and surrender. Heaven reroutes. This is the part many people do not understand because they are trained to think in straight lines. They assume provision must come through the visible sequence they planned. They assume blessing must travel through the people they expected. They assume support must look familiar, or else it does not count. But God often protects chosen ones from idolatry by disrupting their dependence on predictable systems. He allows the expected channel to fail so the heart can remember who the true provider is. He allows the delay to expose how much fear had attached itself to a certain source. He allows the blockage to teach you that what he has assigned to you is larger than any one human gatekeeper. That does not mean the season is easy. It often feels terrifying while it unfolds. But in the end, it becomes a deeper education in divine supply. You begin to recognize a pattern in your own life. Just when it looked impossible, something unexpected moved. Just when it seemed like the last option had collapsed, another way opened. Just when the silence felt unbearable, provision appeared from a place you had not even considered. This is not coincidence. This is the fingerprint of a God who refuses to let his children believe they are held hostage by earthly systems. What heaven has assigned to you cannot be permanently blocked by earthly interference. Delayed, yes. Contested, yes. Hidden for a time, yes. But permanently cancelled, no. Because human power does not outrank divine intent. That truth should not make you passive. It should make you anchored. It should teach you to stop worshipping channels and start honoring the source. It should quiet the panic that says everything is over, simply because your preferred road is closed. Chosen one, your story is not at the mercy of one broken system. Your next meal, your next opening, your next breath of relief is not imprisoned by one delayed response. God can reach across broken chains, failed systems, withheld support, and hostile conditions and still make sure you are fed. And if you need proof that this is not just beautiful language but a pattern woven throughout sacred history, then look closely at the way God has always provided when systems fail, because Scripture does not present divine provision as a theory. It presents it as a pattern. Again and again, God fed his people in conditions where ordinary supply routes had collapsed. Elijah did not survive because the economy improved. He survived because God commanded ravens to bring him bread and meat in a drought. Think about how strange that is. Ravens are not known for generosity. Drought is not known for abundance. Yet when God decides to sustain a life, he can turn unlikely carriers into couriers of provision. That story alone should shatter the fear that blessing must come through familiar hands. Then consider the wilderness, that long and exhausting school of dependence, where Israel had no farms to harvest, no stable infrastructure, no normal chain of distribution, and yet manna appeared. Daily bread came where no bakery stood, where no field had been planted, where no human logistics could explain the consistency of supply. This was not only about food, it was about revelation. God was teaching his people that survival is not ultimately tied to visible systems. It is tied to his word, his will, and his presence. And then there is the widow whose little oil did not run out the handful of flour that outlasted famine, the loaves and fish that multiplied in open air while a hungry crowd waited. Notice how often divine provision appears at the edge of insufficiency. Notice how often the miracle arrives where systems have already admitted defeat. Notice how often God chooses the impossible setting as the stage for supply. This is because divine provision is not simply about meeting needs. It is about revealing who God is when human certainty collapses. He specializes in feeding people beyond normal routes. He specializes in sustaining purpose where statistics say collapse should happen. He specializes in making sure the chosen one learns that scarcity is never the final authority. Even Joseph's story, though, often read through leadership and strategy, carries this same pattern. In famine, God had already arranged a vessel of preservation ahead of time. In crisis, heaven had already positioned supply. In national lack, divine foresight had already built a storehouse. This is how God moves. He does not react in panic when famine appears. He prepares, he positions, he preserves, he reroutes. And the chosen one must understand that these biblical patterns are not old stories sealed in ancient dust. They are revelations of divine character. The same God who fed in drought, in wilderness, in famine, and among crowds with too little food, is still the God who knows how to sustain you in a season of delayed answers and blocked channels. The form may differ, but the character does not. The method may shift, but the mercy remains. The logistics may look impossible, but the provider is unchanged. That is why your current battle should not be interpreted only through what you can count, measure, or track. There is a deeper economy at work, one where obedience matters, one where trust matters, one where divine timing matters, and one where what appears insufficient can become more than enough in the hands of God. So when you find yourself in a season where provision feels interrupted, do not only ask why the normal system is failing, ask what God may be revealing about his ability to feed you beyond it. Ask what dependence is being purified. Ask what fear is being exposed. Ask what false certainty is being dismantled so that a truer confidence can be built. Because chosen one, this battle is real, but so is the promise. Systems may stagger people, may delay, doors may close, and supply lines may look uncertain, but heaven has never once lost track of those it has called. God still knows how to feed his people anyway, and this is where your understanding begins to deepen. Because scarcity was never the final story, even though in the middle of the season, it may have felt like a permanent sentence written over your life. There were moments when lack looked so consistent, so repetitive, so stubborn, that you began to read it as rejection. You started wondering whether the closed hands, the delayed answers, the dried up support, and the constant almosts were saying something final about your worth. That is what scarcity tries to do when it stays too long. It does not merely reduce what is around you, it begins to whisper against what is within you. It tries to make you believe that because something has not arrived, you are somehow less remembered, less favored, less seen, less chosen. But the chosen one must learn one of the hardest and holiest lessons of spiritual maturity. Lack is not always a verdict. Sometimes it is a classroom. Sometimes it is not proof that heaven has turned away, but proof that heaven is teaching you how not to build your peace on fragile things. What looked like scarcity was often a test of trust, endurance, and spiritual alignment. God was not trying to starve your soul. He was trying to separate your heart from misplaced dependence. He was teaching you not to worship the channel that carried the blessing, not to cling to the hand so tightly that you forgot the one who moved it. Because when provision comes through the same route for too long, people can slowly begin to confuse the messenger with the source. They can start praying less and calculating more. They can start trusting patterns more than presence. They can start feeling safe because a system appears stable instead of because God remains faithful. So when the chain was disrupted, when the flow looked interrupted, when the usual support did not show up on time, you thought maybe everything was collapsing. But beneath that fear, a deeper recalibration was happening. Your spirit was being retrained to recognize provision with clearer eyes. You were learning that divine faithfulness does not always wear the clothes of predictability. Sometimes it looks like just enough strength for one more day. Sometimes it looks like a sudden idea that keeps you moving. Sometimes it looks like a peace that should not be there considering the pressure. Sometimes it looks like a tiny door that opens when larger gates stay shut. The chosen one often expects provision to look dramatic, obvious, overwhelming. But God sometimes begins by teaching you how to see the sacred in smaller mercies. Not because He intends to keep you in barely enough forever, but because He wants your perception purified before your abundance arrives. If your eyes are trained only to see God in excess, you may miss Him in endurance. If your heart is trained only to praise Him in overflow, you may fail to recognize how many times He already kept you alive in quiet ways. Scarcity was never the final story because the story was never actually about scarcity. It was about trust. It was about whether you could remain aligned when the visible evidence looked thin. It was about whether you could keep your heart from becoming bitter when the table seemed delayed. It was about whether your soul would still turn upward when the ground beneath you felt uncertain. And all of that is preparing you for the moment when what was held back begins to move again, because what was blocked is not necessarily lost. This is the part of the enemy hopes you never fully realize. Delay is one thing, permanent theft is another, and many chosen ones have suffered unnecessarily because they interpreted obstruction as finality. They assumed that because a resource stalled, it vanished. Because a person withheld, the blessing died. Because an opportunity slipped from the expected route, the whole promise had been cancelled. But God knows how to reroute provision. He knows how to redirect what resistance tried to stop. He knows how to move resources through unexpected roads, how to send support through unfamiliar hands, how to bring timing around through a side entrance when the front gate is crowded with interference. What was held back may have been delayed by people, by systems, by fear, by confusion, by resistance you could not name, but that does not mean heaven crossed it off the record. Some things are not lost, they are in rerouting. Some doors did not die, they changed corridors. Some answers did not vanish. They are moving through a different sequence than the one you imagined. And this is why you must prepare yourself, not in panic, but in expectancy. The chosen one must become alert to surprise openings, last-minute breakthroughs, divine connections, and strange yet precise alignments that appear after long silence. Because once God begins redirecting flow, it often arrives with a signature that humbles human prediction. You may receive help from the person you never thought to ask. You may find provision in a field you never planned to enter. You may discover that what looked like rejection was actually a refusal meant to keep you from settling beneath your level. God's rerouting is not sloppy, it is strategic. Sometimes He lets a lesser opportunity fail because a more fitting one is already in motion. Sometimes He allows people to withhold because He is protecting you from tying your gratitude to the wrong altar. Sometimes He delays the visible answer because the timing of the redirected answer will reveal His hand more clearly than the first path ever could. That is why spiritual maturity in this season means learning not to freeze your imagination around one method. Do not tell God that provision must arrive only through one employer, one contract, one person, one institution, one city, one timeline. The moment you do that, fear gains too much control because your mind has reduced divine possibility to a single road. But the chosen one is being invited into a wider vision. Provision can turn, favor can bend. Opportunities can circle back wearing a different face. Resources can reappear from angles that seemed closed. You are not waiting in an empty universe. You are standing in a life governed by a God who knows how to redirect supply. And while that redirection is taking place, there is another truth that becomes essential to understand, because God feeds more than the body. If all provision were material, many chosen ones would have collapsed long before this moment. If divine care were measured only in visible income, open doors, and external support, your story would feel much bleaker than it really is. But heaven has been sustaining you in more ways than your fear first noticed. God has been feeding your spirit with strength when your body felt tired with wisdom, when your path felt unclear with peace, when circumstances should have produced panic with healing, when old wounds tried to reopen with strategy, when the environment looked barren and with clarity, when confusion seemed to fill the air. That inner sustenance matters more than many people realize, because there are seasons where the first sign of divine provision is not money in your hand, but stability in your soul. There are seasons where God feeds you by keeping your mind from fracturing under pressure. He feeds you by protecting your heart from total despair. He feeds you by sending one insight at the right moment, one scripture that strikes like lightning, one unexpected breath of calm in the middle of chaos, one conversation that confirms you are not wandering blindly. The chosen one often underestimates these forms of nourishment because they do not always solve the visible problem instantly, but they keep you alive long enough to reach the visible solution. They preserve your core. They stop you from spiritually starving, while the outer provision is still moving. Think of how many times you feared you were running empty, and yet somehow you remained standing. How many times you thought you had no more emotional capacity, and yet the next morning you were still able to pray, still able to think, still able to move, still able to make one more wise decision. That was not mere personality, that were grace, that was sustenance, that was God feeding you in the hidden places. He was nourishing courage where fear wanted to dominate. He was nourishing patience where urgency wanted to control you. He was nourishing discernment where desperation wanted to make reckless choices. He was nourishing your identity so that external lack would not completely rewrite your inner story. This is why the chosen one must stop measuring provision too narrowly. Yes, material needs matter. Yes, real-world support matters. Yes, doors and resources matter. But if God had not also sustained your spirit, none of the external provision would have mattered, because you would have reached it empty, cynical, compromised, or broken beyond recognition. Instead, He has been feeding your inner life quietly, faithfully, and often invisibly. He has kept a flame alive in you that circumstances could not fully explain. He has been teaching you how to draw strength from Him even when the outer table looked sparse. And this hidden nourishment has a purpose beyond mere endurance. It is revealing a deeper lesson at the center of the entire battle, because the supply chain struggle has been exposing who the true source really is. People are not the source. Jobs are not the source. Systems are not the source. Markets are not the source. Even the most reliable channels are not the source. They may carry provision, but they do not create it. They may distribute blessing, but they do not author destiny. God alone is the true provider, and the chosen one had to learn this with more than intellect. You had to learn it in your nerves, in your waiting, in your interrupted plans, in your trembling prayers, in the ache of seeing familiar channels fail. This lesson is uncomfortable because human beings naturally attach safety to what they can predict. They feel calmer when they know where the support is coming from, when the paycheck is regular, when the relationship is stable, when the system is functioning. There is nothing wrong with gratitude for these things, but there is danger in enthroning them. There is danger in suddenly allowing a channel to occupy the psychological space that belongs to God. Because once a channel becomes your functional source, fear will always haunt you. You will live one disruption away from collapse, one delay away from panic, one broken expectation away from interpreting life as abandonment. So this battle has been a severe mercy. It has been revealing where your trust was over-attached to visible structures. It has been teaching you to honor channels without worshipping them. It has been showing you that provision can move through many roads, but source remains one. This matters deeply for your next season, because when the blessing comes, you must not glorify the courier above the king. You must not become so impressed with the method that you forget the mercy behind it. You must not tell the story as though a job saved you, a person saved you, a contact saved you, a trend saved you, a system saved you. No, they may have been part of the route, but they were not the origin. God was. He always was. And learning that now will protect your heart later. It will keep your gratitude clean. It will keep your identity free. It will stop abundance from turning into a new bondage of dependence on visible things. The chosen one must emerge from this season with a revelation that cannot easily be shaken if the channel changes. God is still God. If the route bends, God is still faithful. If the system stumbles, God still knows how to provide. That revelation gives you a kind of freedom that scarcity can no longer bully. It steadies you. It quiets the frantic worship of outcomes. It teaches your spirit to rest more deeply in the character of the provider. And once that revelation takes root, a victorious confidence begins to rise, because you start to understand that you will eat in front of the delay. You will not starve while obstruction tries to impress you. You will not disappear because resistance showed up in the process. You will not be erased because answers came late. There is a table being prepared for you in the middle of this obstruction. Not after all the resistance vanishes. Not after every enemy admits defeat. Not after every system suddenly becomes fair, but in the middle of it. That is what makes divine provision so humiliating to darkness. It does not always wait for the battlefield to become peaceful. It appears right there in sight of the resistance, in sight of the delay, in sight of the blockage that thought it had the final word. The chosen one will eat your, grow, survive, and advance even while unfinished tensions still exist around them. That is why you must stop speaking over yourself as though delay equals death. Delay is not your grave, delay is not your identity. Delay is an environment, and even in that environment, God can spread a table. He can send the exact conversation you need. He can release the right amount at the right hour. He can keep your mind clear enough to recognize the opening. He can nourish your energy, preserve your reputation, strengthen your relationships, and move practical help toward you while the outer picture still looks incomplete. Think about the confidence this creates. Not fake confidence, not denial, not pretending nothing hurts, but a deeper kind of steadiness that says, even here I will be sustained, even here I will not be abandoned, even here I will eat. And when God does this, it embarrasses the resistance, because the very conditions that were meant to weaken you become the backdrop for visible favor. The delay remains present, but it no longer rules the atmosphere. The obstruction remains real, but it no longer determines the ending. Provision arriving in front of the delay becomes a testimony that heaven does not wait for human systems to become perfect before it moves. It confirms divine favor in a way that no theory can. It tells your soul and everyone watching that the Chosen One is not surviving on luck. The Chosen One is being sustained by God. And this is why the next season is not merely about getting by. It is not merely about making it through with scraped knees and a tired heart. It is not merely about surviving one more cycle of postponement. No, your next season will overflow. Once God breaks the false power of delay and blocks supply, once he exposes the lie that obstruction had the authority to define your future, the movement that follows will not only restore what felt missing, it will exceed the language of barely enough. The Chosen One is moving from rationing hope to carrying expectation, from watching crumbs to recognizing abundance, from asking whether there will be enough to discovering that heaven was preparing more than you realized. Overflow does not only mean excess money or visible resources, though it may include those things. Overflow means acceleration after stagnation. It means restoration after depletion. It means open doors after prolonged corridor seasons. It means visible evidence that God did not forget your address, your labor, your tears, your waiting, or your obedience. The next season brings a kind of relief that is more than emotional. It is structural. Things begin to move with less friction. Support becomes clearer. Right relationships begin to align. Ideas gain traction. Opportunities carry peace instead of confusion. The energy that once leaked through delay starts flowing toward purpose. And perhaps most beautifully of all, the overflow carries confirmation. It proves that the dry season was not a final sentence. It proves that the resistance was never sovereign. It proves that God had a timeline deeper than your fear could read. This is why you must not let the memory of lack teach you to expect smallness forever. Do not become so adapted to drought that you resist rivers when they come. Do not become so familiar with barely enough that abundance feels suspicious. Part of your preparation now is internal. You must let your spirit expand again. You must allow yourself to imagine a life where provision moves with grace, where support arrives without begging, where opportunity no longer comes wrapped in confusion, where your needs are met and your calling is resourced. Because heaven is not only bringing you out of delay, heaven is teaching you how to receive overflow without forgetting the source. And that balance is the beauty of the Chosen One's next season. You will have more, but you will worship less at the altar of more. You will receive through channels, but you will cling less to channels. You will walk in visible blessing, but with a deeper humility, because you remember the wilderness. You remember the strange silences. You remember the prayers whispered in seasons where everything looked jammed. And because you remember your abundance will carry reverence, your overflow will carry wisdom, your restoration will carry testimony. You will not simply say, "I made it." You will say, "God fed me anyway." And in that confession there is victory, because the battle that once looked like obstruction becomes the very story that proves heaven never lost control.